Session 1, Homophobia within a multi-oppression context. My name is Jan Bridget, and I'd like to welcome you to this free training course. It's the result of over 25 years of working with LGBT people and designing and delivering homophobia and anti-oppression awareness training. The training has evolved as a result of this experience, as well as my own experience as a butch lesbian who comes from a poor, lower-class background. My experience is different to other lesbians who are middle class, or femme, or disabled, or black and minority ethnic, to bisexual women, to say nothing of gay and bisexual men. I believe that, as a butch lesbian, I have greater empathy with transgender people. Some of the issues facing lesbian, gay and bisexual people are similar to those facing transgender people. However, there are some very important differences, because of which I strongly advise you to seek training from an expert on transgender issues. I came to realise that we cannot look at homophobia on its own without understanding it within a multi-oppression context, hence the title. As I developed my understanding about multi-oppression, I went on a personal journey, realising that oppression works along similar lines, but with some important differences, against all oppressed and minority groups, and that a lot of the effects are also similar. This has led me to the conclusion that we cannot fight one oppression on its own, but that we have to fight all oppression. The further I go on this journey, the more I become aware of how complicated the system is and how important it is to continue learning. I believe and hope that I am open to new learning. And I very much hope that this training will help you widen your empathy and understanding with and towards all oppressed and minority groups. I want to begin by defining homophobia and heterosexism. And I want to point out straight away that not everyone would agree with these definitions. Homophobia is the recognised or unrecognised fear or hatred of homosexuals or homosexuality that is found in both heterosexuals and homosexuals. The bottom line is that if you've been brought up in this country, you will have been brought up to be homophobic. Heterosexism is discrimination against homosexuals based on the belief that heterosexuality is superior to homosexuality. All of our institutions are heterosexist. The bottom line is that heterosexism is systematically built into all of our institutions. I like to use these two definitions because they help to make a distinction between internal, i.e. phobia, and external, that is, ism. I will go further into internal and external oppression later. I also like these definitions because, with a slight change in the words, they can be applied to misogyny and sexism, xenophobia and racism, and so on. In other words, misogyny is the recognised or unrecognised fear or hatred of females or femininity that is found in both men and women. We've all been taught to be misogynistic. Sexism is discrimination against females based on the belief that being male or masculinity is superior to being female or femininity. Sexism is built into all of our institutions. I want to also stress that there are two sides to the coin, oppression and privilege. I want to also point out that we can do something about our internal oppression privilege, but it's harder to challenge institutional oppression and power. What is oppression? In order to understand oppression better, I ask participants to shout out words and phrases that come to their minds when they think about the word oppression. After writing up a few words and phrases on the flip chart, I put up the next slide and I explain that this is a list of words, phrases that I've collected over several training events. So oppression is victimization, power imbalance, bullying, lack of rights, discrimination, less eligibility, disempowerment, low self-worth, lack of respect, alienation, being kept down, feeling of isolation, internalized oppression, being made to feel worthless and inferior, social control disguised as being for the good of society, restrictions, barriers to freedom of behaviour, speech. It can be overt or covert attitudes and behaviour that stops others from being themselves, browbeaten into another's way of life, abuse, misuse of power, not being allowed to own your own views, the effect of socialisation. I think you'll agree that this helps us to understand the profound nature of oppression. As I mentioned earlier, there are two sides to the coin, i.e. oppression and privilege. So what is privilege? A dictionary definition of privilege says the rights, advantages and immunities enjoyed by a small, usually powerful group or class, especially to the disadvantage of others. This is fine as a definition, but if we really want to understand more about privilege, we need to simply look at the previous slide with words and phrases that describe oppression. So privilege is the opposite of oppression, i.e. not being a victim, having power, not being bullied, having rights, not being discriminated against, being eligible, not being disempowered, having self-worth, having respect, not being alienated, not being kept down, not being isolated, not internalising oppression, and so on. I don't know how you feel, but this list always hits me strongly and hurts. I'd just like you to think about it for a minute or two. Have you ever heard of the term unearned privilege? It was coined by an American professor called Peggy McIntosh. This is her definition. Privileges or advantages one gets just because one belongs to a valued group in society, not because of individual efforts which earned them, but simply because of involuntary membership in a privileged group. We are usually totally unaware of unearned privilege. In her paper, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Backpack, Peggy McIntosh includes a long list of questions about white privilege. I've chosen 10 of these questions, which I will now list. Clearly, the questions are about white privilege, but I would also ask you to look at the question from the perspective of a gay person, a disabled person, a woman, or a poor lower class person. For some of you, like me, you'll be looking at them from multiple angles. For example, I could be answering the question as either a gay person, a woman, and or someone from a poor lower class background. but I would still experience unearned privilege from a white and non-disabled perspective. Here are the questions. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. I can be pretty sure that my neighbours in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. I can be sure that my children will be given curriculum materials that testify to the existence of their race. I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. I can go home from most meetings of organisations I belong to, feeling somewhat tied in rather than isolated, out of place, outnumbered, unheard, held at a distance, or feared. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race. I can choose public accommodation without fearing that people of my race cannot get in or will be mistreated in the places I have chosen. If my day, week, or year is going badly, I need not ask of each negative episode or situation whether it has racial overtones. Using a similar technique, Kevin Jennings, who is the editor of the book Becoming Visible, a reader in gay and lesbian history for high school and college students, Allison Publications, 1994, came up with the following questions regarding heterosexual privileges. What Kevin has done is turn on their head questions that LGBT people are asked all of the time. What do you think caused your heterosexuality? When and how did you first decide you were heterosexual? Is it possible heterosexuality is a phase you will grow out of? Is it possible you are heterosexual because you fear the same sex? If you've never slept with someone of the same sex, how do you know you wouldn't prefer that? Is it possible you merely need a good gay experience? To whom have you disclosed your heterosexuality, and how did they react? Heterosexuality isn't offensive as long as you leave others alone. Why, however, do so many heterosexuals try to seduce others into their orientation? Most child molesters are heterosexual. Do you consider it safe to expose your children to heterosexuals, heterosexual teachers in particular? Why are heterosexuals so blatant, always making a spectacle of their heterosexuality? Why can't they just be who they are and not flaunt their sexuality by kissing in public, wearing wedding rings, etc.? How can you have a truly satisfying relationship with someone of the opposite sex, given the obvious physical and emotional difference? Heterosexual marriage has total societal support, yet over half of all heterosexuals who marry this year will divorce. Why are there so few successful heterosexual relationships? Given the problems heterosexuals face, would you want your children to be heterosexual? Would you consider aversion therapy and try and change them? I then asked people to shout out groups of people who were oppressed. After a while, I put up the following slide and see if any are missing from either list. Black and minority ethnic groups, disabled groups, LGBTs, old people, young people, people who are HIV positive, women, lower class, poor, people with learning difficulties, people who are fat or people who are thin, travellers, drug users, unemployed, people with mental health problems, some religious groups. Are there any others? As we become more aware, we're likely to add new groups. Clearly, the privileged groups are the opposite, i.e. white people, non-disabled people, heterosexuals, and so on. Several years ago, I came up with the following two diagrams as a way of bringing together the effects of external and internal oppression. The first diagram is about external oppression. Those on the left are privileged groups, whilst those on the right are oppressed groups. People who belong to privileged groups, in general, have access to better education, which leads on to wider and higher horizons. They are likely to have better employment opportunities with more job satisfaction and better pay. They are less likely to be unemployed. All this leads on to more status, power, influence, and more social outlets. At the same time, people who belong to this group can be more independent from their families, experience better housing, and are less likely to be homeless, experience less harassment, and are unlikely to be the victims of hate crime. People who belong to oppressed groups, on the other hand, in general have worse access to education, which leads on to lower and narrower horizons. They are more likely to have poorer employment opportunities with less job satisfaction and poor pay. They are more likely to be unemployed. All this leads on to less status, power and influence, and fewer social outlets. At the same time, they are more likely to be dependent on their families, experience poor housing, are more likely to experience homelessness and harassment, and are likely to be the victims of hate incidents. As I've already noted, most of us belong to both privileged and oppressed groups. So, for example, although I left school at 15 without any qualifications, as a mature student at 26, I was able to acquire a grant and went to college and then university. This changed my life completely. Up to this point, I'd worked in factories, then was in the Royal Air Force for 6 years, but I had to leave as homosexuality was illegal. I then became a secretary, but quickly realised that I would never gain promotion without qualifications. I was lucky enough to live at a time in history when grants were available to further your education. Originally, I planned to become a university lecturer, but decided instead to become a youth and community worker with the aim of using my education and privilege to support people from similar backgrounds to me. I qualified as a youth and community worker and began working for Lancashire County Council. But after coming out as lesbian at my first staff conference, I experienced discrimination and was told that, as a lesbian, I could not apply for a position of working with girls. Eventually, I was told that I would never gain promotion in Lancashire and was advised to leave. This was despite them having an equal opportunities policy which included sexual orientation. But this was before discrimination in employment on the grounds of sexuality became illegal. I then gave up working in the mainstream and in 1987 set up, with my then partner Sandra Lucille, Lesbian Information Service, and have been an activist ever since. This next slide brings together the effects of internal privilege and oppression. On the left are privileged groups. People who belong to this group have far greater visibility in the media, on television, films, books, magazines and newspapers. And the majority of this visibility is positive. By this I mean the images are positive ones. Rarely do we find a person from a privileged group as a negative stereotype. What in effect this does is make privileged groups more acceptable and the norm. People who belong to privileged groups are far less likely to feel isolated because they are constantly seeing positive images of people like themselves being reflected back at them. They internalise these messages, giving them a stronger identity and higher self-esteem. Because of this, they are less vulnerable to suggestion. They have more confidence and are more assertive. All this leads on to better mental health, less need and use of alcohol and drugs, which in turn leads on to better general health. The reverse is the case for people who belong to oppressed groups. There's much less visibility of oppressed groups, and when there is, it's usually negative. Most images of people who belong to oppressed groups are negative stereotypes. This means that there is great distrust of people who belong to oppressed groups. They are more unacceptable and outside of the norm. People who belong to oppressed groups are more likely to feel isolated and feel bad about themselves. They internalise all the negative messages, giving them a weaker identity and lower self-esteem. They are more vulnerable to suggestion. They have less confidence and are less assertive. All this leads on to poorer mental health, more need and use of alcohol and drugs as a way of coping, which in turn leads on to worse general health. At the same time, people from oppressed groups also internalise the positive messages about people from privileged groups, whilst people from privileged groups also internalise the negative messages about oppressed groups. It's much harder for a person who has multiple layers of oppression to climb out of the multiple effects of both internal and external oppression. This slide also looks at service provision. People who belong to privileged groups have less need and less use of public services, whilst oppressed groups have far greater need and use of public services. It's therefore ironic that, as the diagram shows, it's usually people from privileged groups who control services. There's more research and information available about privileged groups and less about oppressed groups. This means there's greater visibility of the issues facing privileged people as opposed to oppressed people. People who belong to privileged groups have more alternatives available to them, whereas people who belong to oppressed groups are dependent on public services. If people who belong to privileged groups do use public services, they're more likely to demand better services, whilst oppressed groups are less likely to demand better services. In turn, all this means that there are better services for privileged groups and worse services for oppressed groups, despite them being in far greater need. As Peggy McIntosh said back in 1989, as a white, heterosexual, middle-class Christian woman, her education taught her that she was superior in many ways, apart from being a woman. It did not tell her that she was an oppressor, albeit an ignorant oppressor, and that because of her background, she had a lot of unearned privilege. She was taught to believe that she was the norm, the average, and also the ideal. As I've pointed out several times, most of us belong to both groups. I asked participants to get into pairs for this following exercise. I asked them first of all to identify which privileged groups they belong to and which oppressed groups. I then asked them to share one example of unearned privilege and one example of when they've been oppressed. I stress that I don't want people to out themselves if they don't want to. I then ask for feedback from anyone who wants to share anything. I want to conclude this session with a quote from Peggy McIntosh from 1989. It seems to me that obliviousness about white advantage, like obliviousness about male advantage, is kept strongly inculturated in the United States so as to maintain the myth of meritocracy, the myth that democratic choice is equally available to all. Keeping most people unaware that freedom of confident action is there for just a small number of people props up those in power and serves to keep power in the hands of the same groups that have most of it already.